In the quiet of an early November morning, long before the noise of Abuja begins to rise, a different kind of sound fills the air: silence. The kind of silence that comes when ordinary people are waiting for something they cannot control. Mothers preparing breakfast, elderly men sitting outside their shops, young people scrolling through their phones in tense anticipation, all of them watching the calendar, watching the clock, watching the slow countdown toward a day that could reshape the future of their region. Today is November 17th, 3 days before a judgment that has taken nearly 10 years to arrive. 3 days before Justice James Omotosho of the Federal High Court is expected to deliver a ruling in the long and painful case of Nnamdi Kanu. And just as this final stretch begins, something unexpected happens. U.S. observers quietly enter Abuja. They do not come to discuss security. They do not come for diplomacy. They come to sit in a courtroom and watch one man's fate step by step, hour by hour. For many Nigerians, this raises a difficult question. Why now? Why would representatives believed by many to be connected to the U.S. government arrive exactly 3 days before the ruling? What are they here to see? And what do they expect to happen between now and November the 20th? Across the country, people are whispering the same thought. Something is about to shift. Letters have been written, warnings have been issued, deals have been recalled, and behind closed doors, legal teams are moving faster than they ever have before. So in this video, we're going to walk through every one of those movements: the letters, the pressure, the political promises, and the 5 actions the U.S. observers say they will take as this case reaches its climax. If you're watching from the United States, especially if you're over 60 and you've lived long enough to know what justice should look like, then stay with me until the end. And please subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than the headlines. When you follow a case for nearly a decade, the weight of every new development feels heavier than the last. And in the story of Nnamdi Kanu, each document, each court date, each sudden shift in tone has carried the same message: nothing is simple anymore. To understand how we arrived at this moment, November 17th, 3 days before judgment, you have to trace the movement of events not from today, but from earlier this month, when the groundwork for this week was quietly being laid. It begins on November 6th. On that day, lead counsel Aloy Ejimakor sent a formal letter, one that now sits at the center of the U.S. observers' interest. This wasn't just another filing. For those who have been following this case, it felt like a signal flare. Aloy later followed up with another message written in Igbo, a message layered with cultural meaning, one that people from the outside wouldn't easily decode, but which many in the Southeast immediately understood as a warning something unusual was coming, something that required attention. Then came November 10th, a moment that added both legitimacy and urgency to the growing pressure. On that day, the Abuja State House of Assembly passed an official resolution calling the prolonged detention of Nnamdi Kanu a matter of urgent public importance. After years of silence from political leaders, this declaration struck like a bell in a quiet room. It wasn't just symbolic. It authorized the Assembly to directly appeal to the President of Nigeria, asking for 2 things: unconditional release and presidential pardon. For Kanu's supporters, the word pardon was painful because a pardon implies guilt. But for the legal team and for foreign observers, the meaning was strategic. If every possible door is opened, then the government cannot later hide behind procedural excuses. And then as tension thickened, a new development emerged. On November 17th, U.S. observers arrived in Abuja. They came quietly. No press conferences, no flashing cameras, just an unannounced entry into a city already on edge. To many Nigerians, their arrival felt far from coincidental. They came exactly 3 days before Justice James Omotosho is expected to deliver a ruling, not earlier in the year, not after the judgment, right before it. Their presence raised questions that were too sharp to ignore. What had they been told? What did they expect to witness? And why had they insisted that certain documents, letters, petitions, resolutions reach the president before they touch down? This leads back to a critical instruction they gave the legal team: put everything on record. For that reason, the lawyers, including Aloy Maxwell Opara and several others, were asked to provide a formal letter addressed directly to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, requesting both release and pardon. Not because they expect the president to comply, but because legality is a battlefield and every missing document is a weakness. And so the Abuja State Assembly sent its letter citing not only humanitarian concerns, but also referencing earlier pardons granted by the president. Soon after, national newspapers like The Guardian published headlines confirming the move. For those tracking the case, this was not just paperwork, it was evidence. Evidence that the observers themselves wanted to hold. But the story doesn't stop at letters and resolutions. At almost the same time, Kanu filed a N50 billion lawsuit against the Nigerian Medical Association, NMA, accusing it of submitting a false medical report during his terrorism trial. This unexpected legal strike widened the battlefield. It created new pressure points not only on political actors, but also on professional bodies that rarely find themselves in the middle of political storms. And above all of this, above the letters, the lawsuits, the observers' arrival, stood the date that has been circled in red by millions of Nigerians, November 20th. This is the day Justice Omotosho is set to deliver judgment. This is the day that has drawn foreign observers, political leaders, legal strategists, and worried families into the same orbit. This is the day that could imprison a man, free him, or push the country into a new period of uncertainty. What began on November 6th has now ripened into a full-blown showdown. And the closer we move to November 20th, the more every movement, every document, every whisper, every foreign visitor feels like part of a larger unfolding script. There is a moment in every long political struggle when the story stops being abstract and becomes intensely personal. In the case of Nnamdi Kanu, that moment arrived the very second word spread that U.S. observers had quietly entered Abuja, not months before, not after the ruling, but 3 days before judgment. For many Nigerians, it felt as though the world had just pulled a chair into the courtroom. And from that point forward, the emotional temperature around the case rose sharply. The first wave of reaction came in whispers. Some asked whether this was a sign of hope. Others wondered whether it was already too late. Older Nigerians remembered past trials where foreign observers stood by, but changed nothing. Younger ones believed this time might be different because the observers didn't simply appear. They came with 5 promises, 5 commitments, 5 actions they said they were prepared to take as the clock ticked toward November 20th. The first promise struck at the core of public doubt, monitoring the fairness of the trial. For nearly 10 years, supporters have complained about secrecy delays, unexplained rulings, and unusual procedures. Now, observers were saying, "We will watch everything." They committed to ensuring that evidence is handled properly, that political influence is kept out of the courtroom, and that due process is not violated in the final hours of this historic case. But this immediately triggered a second reaction among Nigerians. Why didn't you do this in July? Because these same observers were said to have come earlier in the year, yet nothing changed. So while some welcomed the promise, others carried the quiet skepticism that comes from a long memory of disappointment. The second promise was even more consequential. They would report directly to their government. Older Nigerians understand the weight of that sentence far more deeply than younger ones. Reports from observers are not mere paperwork. They can influence diplomatic decisions, sanctions, security cooperation, and international pressure. They can determine whether a political leader is treated as a partner or as a liability. And the fact that the observers' findings might reach the highest levels of leadership in Washington added an entire new dimension to this case. Then came the third promise: international visibility. In a country where trials can happen quietly behind closed doors, the idea that the world could be watching felt like a shield. International visibility makes it harder for a government to act in darkness. It brings media attention, legal scrutiny, and political cost. It forces even powerful actors to consider whether their actions will stand up to external examination. For many Nigerians, this promise, the promise of light, felt like the beginning of accountability. The fourth promise targeted the very thing that has frustrated Kanu's supporters for years, encouraging Nigeria to follow its own laws. This was a reminder that the issue isn't foreign interference, it is consistency. If the country has rules about detention, bail, legal access, and trial procedure, then those rules should apply to everyone, including politically sensitive defendants. Observers said they would highlight any violations, delays, or abuses and make sure they were documented. For older Americans, watching this part of the story mirrors countless civil rights struggles where the question was not whether the law existed, but whether it was applied. And finally came the fifth promise: supporting human rights organizations. The observers said their findings could be sent to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, UN human rights bodies, and domestic NGOs. This created the sense that even after November 20th, the case would not simply vanish. It would continue to be monitored, discussed, and questioned on the global stage. But perhaps the strongest emotional reaction came not from what the observers promised, but from how ordinary Nigerians responded to those promises. The host's message captured that sentiment clearly. It is one thing to make a promise. It is another thing to keep it. We will hold you accountable. And so the climax of this story is not just the arrival of foreign observers, it is the collision between 10 years of frustration and 5 promises of oversight. It is the moment when a local legal battle becomes an international conversation. And it is the recognition that for the first time in years, the outcome of one courtroom in Abuja could echo far beyond Nigeria's borders. When a courtroom becomes the center of a nation's attention, the consequences begin far beyond the walls of the court itself. And in the days leading up to November 20th, the civil and political ripples surrounding Nnamdi Kanu's case have become impossible to ignore. Every move, both from his legal team and from the government, has triggered reactions that reach into ordinary neighborhoods, political circles, and even foreign prisons. One of the most significant elements shaping public perception is the figure presiding over the case, Justice James Omotosho. For months, he has become a symbolic character in this story, not because of his personal beliefs, which the public cannot truly know, but because of the pressure that many assume he faces. In conversations across Nigeria, people quietly say the same thing: he knows the right thing to do. Yet those same voices add a darker suspicion that powerful political actors may be guiding the outcome from behind the curtain. Every allegation in this area must be spoken carefully. But the sentiment itself is real. It reflects a long-standing civil anxiety. When political stakes rise, the independence of institutions becomes fragile. And ordinary Nigerians, especially those old enough to remember past political trials, understand what it means when a judge is caught between the law and the expectations of those who appointed him. At the same time, Nnamdi Kanu has refused to remain passive. From inside DSS custody, he continues to file petitions, challenge decisions, and push the legal system to its limits. Just last week, he submitted fresh documents to the Supreme Court, hoping to change, delay, or complicate the process scheduled for November 20th. For many supporters, this has been a source of hope, proof that even behind bars, he is not silent. For others, it is a reminder of how exhausting this decade-long struggle has become, how many hearings and appeals have come and gone without closure. Yet the consequences of this story are not confined to Kanu alone. Across the ocean, inside a Finnish correctional center, another man connected to this political conflict is fighting his own battle, Simon serving a 6-year sentence in Kilmakoski prison. As November 17th approaches, he is nearing the 1-year mark of his imprisonment. His lawyers are preparing an appeal, but the financial cost, nearly $400 for every hour of legal work, has placed a crushing weight on his shoulders. He is now considering stopping the case at the appeal court level, not because he believes he is wrong, but because justice has become too expensive to pursue. For many viewers, especially older Americans who lived through civil rights trials or political persecutions, this part of the story feels painfully familiar. The struggles of political cases rarely end with one man. They spread outward, touching families, supporters, and even those who live in entirely different countries. And still, the political consequences continue to widen. In Abuja, another drama unfolded: an attempted assassination, targeting a man who publicly challenged the influence of Nyesom Wike. Details remain unclear and investigations are still ongoing, but one thing is certain: the mere fact that someone was attacked for taking a political stand has amplified public fear. It underscored the dangerous climate surrounding political power in Nigeria. When dissent becomes a risk to a man's life, it sends a message about the fragility of civic space. Even the courts themselves are not immune to unexpected shocks. Just days ago, at a high court in Abuja, that same targeted man executed a legal move that shook the whole country, a development separate from the Supreme Court, but powerful enough to influence the legal environment in which Kanu's case sits. The ruling sent waves through political networks, leaving analysts scrambling to understand its long-term implications. Together, these events show that the story unfolding in Abuja is not a simple one. It is a civil story of people tired, hopeful, anxious. It is a political story of power maneuvering behind closed doors. And it is a human story of those who continue fighting, even when the odds grow heavier by the hour. For many Americans watching this story unfold from thousands of miles away, the arrival of U.S. observers in Abuja is more than just a diplomatic footnote. It is a reminder of how justice politics and foreign policy often collide in places where ordinary people rarely have a voice. And for viewers over 60 who have lived through decades of global transitions, from the Cold War to civil rights, from Vietnam to Somalia, this moment in Nigeria may feel strangely familiar. The first question most Americans ask is simple: why does this case matter to the United States? The answer lies in the power of precedent. When a political trial anywhere in the world gains global attention, it becomes a mirror. It reflects not only the strengths and weaknesses of that nation, but also the willingness of others to speak up when fairness is at risk. For U.S. observers, the courtroom in Abuja is not just another foreign venue. It is a test of whether the world still believes in the value of accountability. But their influence has limits. Foreign observers cannot overturn a Nigerian ruling, cannot instruct a judge, cannot interfere with local institutions, and cannot dictate political outcomes. What they can do is something older Americans understand very well. They can document, they can report, they can shine light where power prefers shadows. Documentation, especially when submitted to Washington, can quietly shape diplomatic conversations, travel policies, aid agreements, and human rights frameworks. And while these levers move slowly, they move with weight. In this sense, the observer's presence is not about control, it is about record-keeping that history cannot erase. Beyond the United States, other international actors are watching too. Organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and UN human rights bodies are already familiar with the complexities of Nnamdi Kanu's case. If the observer's reports validate concerns about due process, these organizations could elevate the matter into the global human rights space, where pressure becomes more persistent and more difficult for governments to ignore. Across Africa, the implications ripple further. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Addis Ababa to Dakar, the way Nigeria handles this case sends a message about the strength or fragility of the rule of law on the continent. African governments have long struggled with the perception that legal outcomes depend more on political alliances than on evidence. If a high-profile case ends in controversy, it reinforces a troubling truth that power, not justice, is often the ultimate judge. And this brings us to a broader reflection, one that touches on the rising generation of African leaders who speak about sovereignty, dignity, and a break from old systems. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have electrified millions with their calls for African independence and fairness. But even his supporters, especially older viewers who follow Africa news closely, now ask a difficult question: can any African leader truly redefine justice if the institutions beneath them remain unchanged? Can sovereignty survive if courts are still vulnerable to political pressure? The unfolding story in Abuja does not answer these questions, but it forces them into the global conversation. The U.S., Europe, Africa, and the diaspora all find themselves watching the same courtroom, waiting to see not just what the judge decides, but what that decision reveals about the future of justice on the continent. And for many Americans, especially those who lived through their own era of political trials, the truth is clear. Cases like this are never only about one man. They are about whether a nation is willing to let the world see who it really is. As we return to the quiet places where this story first began, villages in the southeast streets in Abuja, families waiting in living rooms across Nigeria, the tension feels heavier than it did at dawn. The sun has set on November 17th, and with every passing hour, November 20th grows closer. People are not shouting, they are not marching, they are simply waiting with the kind of patience that only comes from years of disappointment and years of hope surviving side by side. In one home, an elderly mother places her phone face down on the table because she cannot bear to read another rumor. In another, young men refresh their screens again and again, searching for any update they might have missed. Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, security officers stand watch, unaware that their small daily movements are now part of an international drama. And somewhere in Abuja, U.S., observers review their notes, cross-check their documents, and prepare for what may happen when the courtroom doors open on the 20th. When you pull back the lens, you begin to see that what hangs in the balance is not one man's freedom alone. It is the credibility of the courts. It is the trust of a region. It is the way a generation of young Africans will understand the meaning of justice. If the trial ends in a way that feels manipulated or unjust, the damage will not stop at the courthouse gate. It will seep into conversations in markets, into classrooms, into political debates, into the global perception of Nigeria itself. And if, on the other hand, the ruling restores public confidence, even partially, then a long and painful chapter may finally begin to turn. But nothing about this moment is guaranteed. We have seen how powerful interests move behind the scenes. We have seen how political calculations can shape legal outcomes. And we have seen how easily a decade-long case can shift direction within a single night. That is why the presence of international eyes matters, not because foreign observers can decide the verdict, but because their documentation becomes part of history's memory. And so before we close this chapter, I want to ask you, especially those watching from the United States, those who lived through your own era of political trials and civil rights battles, do you believe justice can survive when the stakes become political? Do you think leaders across Africa, from Nigeria to Burkina Faso, are truly building systems that protect the innocent? And do you feel that President Ibrahim Traoré's calls for fairness and sovereignty can reshape what justice looks like across this continent? These are questions without simple answers, but they are questions we must keep asking. If you want to continue following these stories from Abuja to Ouagadougou, from Nnamdi Kanu's courtroom to the growing movement for African sovereignty, please share this video so others can stay informed. And subscribe if you believe that truth, dignity, and accountability should always rise above political headlines. Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. And what you say in the comments today may be remembered long after November 20th has passed.